Tribe of names, Simon here and welcome to the channel, and today we're talking about 10 guitar effects that you can get without using any guitar effects pedals whatsoever. Let's talk about it, shall we? Hi there, my name is Simon Godfrey and I'm a professional musician who has spent the past 30 to 35 years working in and sometimes around the music industry, writing and recording. On this channel we provide tips and tricks for the creative musician and songwriter in you. So then, 10 sound design ideas that guitarists can employ without using effects pedals. Now some of these in the list will sound a little bit obvious and in some cases even cliched, but the fact remains is that cliches are cliches for a reason. They're effective and a lot of people have found use for them. Others in this list might sound a little bit odd and sometimes even counterintuitive, but trust me when I say that a lot of the effects that I'm going to be mentioning today, or at least the techniques to provide these effects, have been used by countless classic artists over the years to make their sound a little bit different. Another thing you've got to ask yourself is, why on earth would you employ these kind of techniques? Well, the answer to that is twofold. The first off is that they require little or no additional expense to you, which is always a good thing if you're trying to do something different on a budget. The second thing is that most of these techniques can be employed live on stage, which is very useful, especially if you decide to employ one in the moment during a performance. Now a lot of these techniques are mechanical in nature and might be a little bit beyond your regular playing style, but don't worry, I ask you, certainly when it comes to songwriting and creating of new sounds, be brave in this area. All of these techniques are designed to get you out of your comfort zone and into new sonic territory. So without further ado, let's get into the list. Now the very first effect that I'm going to make mention is the humble volume control on your guitar. Now that might sound a bit mad and indeed obvious, but you would be amazed the kind of artists that have used the volume control to make completely different sounds. Artists like Eddie Van Halen and Ian MacKaye from the band Fugazi, and indeed Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine. All three of these have employed the volume control with maybe a little bit of reverb or delay to great effect. It's amazing to consider the kind of landscapes that all of the artists that I've just mentioned have created just using the humble volume control on the guitar. It's astonishingly underused and overlooked. The second effect you can employ sits right next to your volume control, and that's the tone control on your guitar. Now obviously you've got to have a tone control on your guitar. If you're an 80s shredder with a nice pointy headstock, maybe you just got a volume control, but we'll assume that you actually have a tone control for now. One of the things that I found when I purchased my 2014 Mexican Player Telecaster for stage use is that the tone control on it is surprisingly powerful, and you could get some almost semi wah-wah like effects out of it, which I actually have used on stage from time to time. Third on the list is probably one of my personal favourites, and that's the world of alternate tunings. Artists as diverse as Keith Richards and Joni Mitchell and Curtis Mayfield have all used alternate tunings to great effect. In addition to the 70s artists that made alternate tunings so popular, you've got the drop D tunings of the metal crowd, as well as one of my personal favourites, the Nashville tuning, which allows you access to the high end of the sonic spectrum by using a special set of very high tuned strings. Fourth on the list is something which I dismissed intellectually out of hand before I'd even tried them, and that is the use of slides on your guitar. The reason I had dismissed them for so long is I thought that they would peg me down to the sound of artists like Ry Cooder and Lowell George from Little Feat, and that could not be further from the truth. One of the things that you learn when you songwrite is no matter what equipment you use, you are always quintessentially yourself. Another interesting fact that I found when using slides is that depending on the material of the slide, you get a slightly different textural sound as well, which surprised me no end. So if you're feeling at a loss creatively and you don't know what to do, pick up a slide. It might just change your day. Number 6 on the list is something which has come to help me define my songwriting over the years, and that's the humble Capo, or Capo depending on how you want to pronounce it. I once heard a famous artist on stage back in London describe the Capo as the crap guitarist's friend, and while it's funny, I think it couldn't have been further from the truth when you consider that artists such as John Lennon all the way through to Machine Gun Kelly have employed them on their songs and produced many hits as a result. If you use a capo imaginatively, you can get no end of new sounds out of your guitar. I actually used it for many years right up the top of the neck to provide almost mandolin-like sounds. The one thing that capos allow, which you just cannot do with bar chords using your own hands, is access to parallel chords and open string voicings, which you could never do with just one hand. And then of course you've got things like the partial capo that will allow you to bar certain strings, which give you access to alternate tunings without having to retune. Really useful. Number 7 on the list is probably the cheapest option you can get, but requires maybe the most practice because it comes from in here, and that's the use of dynamics. Now when I talk about dynamics, I'm not just talking about playing gently or playing really hard on the strings. I'm talking about employing techniques that do seem a little bit counterintuitive at first. And to give you some examples of this, I'm thinking about using loud amps played very gently. And a good example of this would probably be dating back to Peter Gabriel's 3, I think it's 3, yes, the one that's called Melt, that was released in 1980, and they employed this tiny little amp, and they used this tiny little amp turned up to full volume so it was completely distorting, and then close mic'd it and then played it both loud and soft, and it gave a completely different texture. Now I've been a recent convert to playing loud amps very quietly, but they are astonishingly hard to master because of course any kind of noise you make on the strings is amplified. You have to really develop a technique for it, but my god, when you get it right, it sounds amazing. You can also go to the opposite end of the spectrum, where you can actually dispense with the amp entirely and mic up your electric guitar acoustically. Now this is perfectly exemplified by a band called Sigur Rós on their first album. Absolutely brilliant. Gets to this end of this really sort of like expansive bit, and then it just collapses down into this acoustic sound of an electric guitar being played. Brilliantly done. Hot on the heels for using extreme dynamics for creating interesting and unusual textures, you also have the ability to use unique playing techniques to provide similarly unique sounds. And when I talk about unusual playing techniques, I'm referring to some of my musical heroes, people like Michael Hedges, who's sadly no longer with us, but who pioneered an entire different kind of technique when employed upon playing an acoustic guitar, which has since blossomed into its own genre of the percussive acoustic community. This percussive kind of playing on the acoustic guitar is probably best exemplified in the modern day by an artist called Jon Gomm, who had a viral hit a little while back with a song called Passionflower. In fact, what I'll do is I'll place a link in the show notes below so you can see exactly how a different mentality towards playing the guitar can give rise to an entirely new genre of music. Speaking personally, I don't profess to be anywhere near as technically proficient as our Mr. Jon Gomm, but I actually have employed the idea of using alternative playing styles in the form of using the humble knife sharpener, which can actually get some quite nice violin-like tones if you play it carefully enough. Number 8 on the list is using the extreme ends of your guitar playing surface to get some unique tonal qualities. Now this is something I didn't really pick up until much later when I was doing a lot more live work, but you really can get a lot of different textures out of playing the guitar at different points on the guitar playing surface. It's astonishing really how you can go from something very plummy to something very percussive and bright. The number of times I've used this just to provide a different kind of texture between verse and chorus, especially when you use it live, is so much easier playing that way than having to look down and hit an effects pedal just to get a different kind of sound. Try it, honestly, it will surprise you. Number 9 on this list is the very low-tech string mute. Now I'll be very honest that I actually came very late to the table when it came to string mutes. Most people actually use them mostly for tapping, but I've actually found that one of the things you can use a string mute for is doing exactly the thing that it's designed to do, which is mute the other strings, which means you can get some very unusual chord voicings without having to do any bar chords. It's very useful in that respect because it gives you a very clean sound, especially useful in very dense mixes because of course not all your strings are ringing at the same time. And finally on this list, please allow me to use one slight cheat code, and that's the humble Ebone. And if you don't know what an Ebone is, basically all it is a magnetic pickup which you place over the magnetic pickup on your guitar, rested on the string, and you get infinite sustain from any note that you play on that string. It's an astonishing device that's been used from everyone from David Bowie to Radiohead to Pat Metheny. I use it very much in a Brian May kind of style to create cathedrals of guitar harmonies that sit in the background of my songs. I love it to bits. So that's my list. But before I go, I just have a couple of thoughts which I'd like to leave with you. The first off is that all of the techniques that I've described today could well be applied, some with a little bit of adjustment, to the bass guitar as well. And I do ask all my guitar friends out there, consider using bass in some instances where you think a guitar might go. You might be surprised by the results. Any one of the above techniques could be a key element in defining your sound and making you stand out from the crowd to reach a wider audience. Think on it. It's not that much effort for a little bit of intellectual bravery. So that's all we have time for this week, and all that remains to be said is, tribe of names, I wish you well and hope you have a good week. See you around.